The morning sun painted the Montana hills golden as Robert Matthews walked across his ranch, checking on the cattle like he did every day for the past 5 years. The autumn air was crisp, and he could see his breath as he counted the herd. Everything seemed perfect in his world. His wife Lucy was 8 months pregnant, and they were both excited about becoming parents. Robert had inherited this ranch from his grandfather. It wasn't the biggest spread in the county, but it was theirs. He and Lucy had worked hard to make it profitable. They raised cattle, grew some crops, and Lucy sold eggs from her chickens at the town market every Saturday. It was a simple life, but they loved it. Lucy was in the kitchen when Robert came back to the house. She was making breakfast, her round belly making it hard for her to reach the stove. Robert smiled as he watched her. She was humming a song she always sang when she was happy. "Morning, beautiful," Robert said, kissing her cheek. "How are you feeling today?" "The baby's been kicking all night," Lucy laughed, rubbing her stomach. "I think we're going to have a little cowboy or cowgirl who's ready to get moving." They sat down for breakfast together, talking about their plans for the baby's room. Robert had been working on a crib in the barn during his spare time. It was made from oak wood that grew on their property. He wanted everything to be perfect for their first child. "Mrs. Henderson is coming next week to help when the baby arrives," Lucy said, cutting her pancakes. "She's delivered more babies than the doctor in town." Mrs. Henderson was an older woman who lived about 10 miles away. She had been a midwife for over 30 years. In those days, many babies were born at home with the help of midwives because doctors were far away and expensive. After breakfast, Robert went back to work. He had to fix a section of fence that the cattle had broken through. As he worked, he could see Lucy hanging laundry on the line behind the house. She moved slowly because of the baby, but she insisted on doing her regular chores. Around noon, Robert heard Lucy calling his name from the house. Her voice sounded different, urgent. He dropped his tools and ran toward the house as fast as he could. "Robert, the baby's coming." Lucy was standing in the doorway, holding her stomach. Her face was pale and she looked scared. "But it's too early," Robert said, his heart racing. "Mrs. Henderson isn't supposed to come until next week. Babies don't wait for schedules," Lucy said, trying to smile despite the pain. "You need to get Mrs. Henderson. Now." Robert helped Lucy to their bed and made her as comfortable as possible. He grabbed blankets and water, remembering things Lucy had told him about childbirth. Then he saddled his fastest horse and rode hard toward Mrs. Henderson's place. The 10-mile ride felt like 100. Robert's horse was sweating and breathing hard by the time they reached Mrs. Henderson's small cabin. He pounded on her door until she answered. "Mrs. Henderson, Lucy's having the baby. You need to come right now." The elderly woman grabbed her medical bag and climbed onto her own horse. They rode back together, but Robert could tell Mrs. Henderson was worried about something. She kept urging her horse to go faster. When they got back to the ranch, Lucy was in serious pain. Mrs. Henderson examined her, and her face became grave. "The baby's not positioned right," she whispered to Robert. "This is going to be difficult." For the next several hours, Mrs. Henderson worked to help Lucy deliver the baby. Robert stayed by his wife's side, holding her hand and wiping sweat from her forehead. Lucy was incredibly brave, but he could see she was getting weaker. "You're doing great, honey," Robert kept saying. "Just a little longer." Outside, storm clouds were gathering. By evening, snow had started to fall. The wind was picking up and Robert could hear it howling around the house. "I need you to ride to town and get Doc Williams," Mrs. Henderson told Robert quietly. "Something's wrong. I've done everything I can, but this baby needs to come out soon or we're going to lose them both." Robert looked at Lucy, who was barely conscious. The thought of leaving her terrified him, but he knew Mrs. Henderson was right. Doc Williams had tools and knowledge that might save them. "I'll be back as fast as I can," he promised Lucy, kissing her forehead. The ride to town was a nightmare. The snow was coming down hard now, and the wind made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Robert's horse struggled through the deepening snow, but they pushed on. This was for Lucy and their baby. Town was 15 miles away on a good day. In the blizzard, it took Robert almost 3 hours to get there. By the time he reached Doc Williams's house, his hands were so cold, he could barely feel them. He pounded on the doctor's door until the man answered. "Doc, you need to come to my ranch right now. Lucy's having the baby and something's wrong." Doc Williams was a good man who had delivered many babies in the county. He quickly gathered his medical bag and instruments, but when he looked outside, at the storm, he shook his head. "Robert, I don't think we can make it in this weather. My horse won't survive that trip in this blizzard." "We have to try," Robert shouted. "Please, Doc. She's going to die without your help." Doc Williams saw the desperation in Robert's eyes. Against his better judgment, he agreed to try. They bundled up in heavy coats and started the journey back to the ranch. The return trip was even worse than the ride to town. The snow was now knee-deep in places and both horses were struggling. Several times they had to stop and rest the animals. Robert was going crazy with worry about Lucy. When they finally reached the ranch, it was past midnight. Robert burst through the door with Doc Williams right behind him. The house was strangely quiet. Mrs. Henderson met them in the main room. She was holding a small bundle wrapped in blankets. There were tears in her eyes. "The baby's alive," she said softly. "A beautiful little girl." Robert felt relief flood through him. "And Lucy? Where's Lucy?" Mrs. Henderson's expression told him everything before she spoke. "I'm so sorry, Robert. We lost her about an hour ago. She fought so hard, but she lost too much blood. There was nothing more I could do." The world seemed to stop spinning. Robert stared at Mrs. Henderson, unable to process what she was saying. "No," he whispered. "No, that can't be right." "She made me promise to tell you something," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice breaking. "She said to tell you that she loves you, and she wants you to take good care of the baby. She said the baby's name should be Grace because she'll be your saving grace." Robert walked to the bedroom where Lucy lay still and peaceful. She looked like she was sleeping. He sat beside her and took her cold hand in his. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Lucy." Doc Williams examined the baby and confirmed she was healthy, despite being born a few weeks early. She was small but strong, with Lucy's dark hair and what looked like Robert's green eyes. "She's going to need to eat every few hours," Doc Williams explained. "Mrs. Henderson can show you how to prepare milk for her. It's going to be challenging, but babies are tougher than they look." Over the next few days, neighbors came to help with Lucy's funeral and to offer their condolences. The whole community was shocked by the tragedy. Lucy had been loved by everyone who knew her. Mrs. Henderson stayed for a week to help Robert learn how to care for baby Grace. She showed him how to warm milk, how to change diapers, and how to soothe a crying baby. But Robert felt completely overwhelmed. "I don't know how to do this," he told Mrs. Henderson one evening as Grace cried in his arms. "I'm a rancher, not a mother. She needs Lucy, not me." "That little girl needs her father," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Lucy trusted you to raise her. You're stronger than you think, Robert." But after Mrs. Henderson left, Robert struggled more than ever. He had to get up several times every night to feed Grace. During the day, he tried to keep up with the ranch, work while caring for a baby. He was exhausted and heartbroken. The house felt empty without Lucy's laughter and singing. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her favorite coffee cup sat on the kitchen counter. Everything reminded Robert of what he had lost. Grace was a good baby, but she cried often, especially at night. Robert would walk the floors with her, trying to remember the songs Lucy used to sing. Sometimes he would cry too, feeling completely alone in the world. The ranch work began to suffer. Cattle needed to be moved to winter pasture, but Robert couldn't leave Grace alone for long periods. Fences needed repair, but he was too tired to do the work properly. Bills from Doc Williams and the funeral were piling up on the kitchen table. Robert's brother Tom came to visit from Colorado and was shocked by what he saw. Robert had lost weight and looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. The house was messy and Grace was fussy. "You can't keep going like this," Tom said. "Why don't you come stay with me and Karen for a while? She could help with the baby." But Robert refused to leave the ranch. This was where he and Lucy had planned to raise their family. This was where Grace belonged. "I'll figure it out," Robert insisted. "I just need time." As winter settled over Montana, Robert felt more isolated than ever. The snow made it difficult for neighbors to visit, and he spent long days alone with Grace. He talked to her constantly, telling her about her mother and about the ranch that would be hers someday. "Your mama was the best person I ever knew," he would say as he fed her. "She would have loved you so much, little Grace. She would have sung to you and taught you how to bake cookies and ride horses." Some night, 3 weeks had passed since Lucy's funeral, and Robert felt like he was drowning. Every day brought new challenges that he never expected when he imagined being a father. Grace needed attention around the clock, and the ranch work was falling behind in ways that worried him deeply. The morning routine had become a careful balance of timing and exhaustion. Robert would wake up before dawn, not because he wanted to, but because Grace's hungry cries pulled him from whatever little sleep he managed to get. He would stumble to the kitchen, warm milk on the stove, and feed her while trying to plan his day around her needs. "Come on, little one," he would whisper as Grace took her bottle. "Daddy's got to check on the cattle today, and you're coming with me." Robert had rigged up a carrier that he could strap to his chest, allowing him to take Grace with him for some of the lighter ranch work. But it was far from ideal. The November cold was bitter, and he worried constantly about keeping her warm enough. Plus, many of the jobs that needed doing were simply too dangerous to attempt while carrying a baby. The cattle were his biggest concern. They needed to be moved to the lower pasture where they would be more protected from the harsh winter winds. It was a job that normally took Robert a full day of hard riding, but he couldn't leave Grace alone for that long. He had tried leaving her in the house for short periods, but her cries could be heard from the barn, and the guilt ate at him. His neighbor, Frank Morrison, had offered to help, but Frank had his own ranch and family to worry about. The few times Frank did come over, Robert could see the pity in his eyes, and it made him feel even more inadequate. "You know, Robert," Frank had said during his last visit, "my wife Betty could watch the baby for a few hours if you need to get some work done." Robert appreciated the offer, but he was hesitant to burden his neighbors. Everyone had their own responsibilities, and he felt like he should be able to handle his own problems. The house itself had become a constant source of stress. Before Lucy died, their home had been clean and organized. Lucy had taken pride in keeping everything neat and making sure they always had good meals. Now dirty dishes piled up in the sink, laundry sat unfolded in baskets, and Robert often forgot to eat until his stomach reminded him. Grace's feeding schedule dominated everything. She needed to eat every 3 hours, which meant Robert's sleep was broken into small chunks. He would finally fall asleep around midnight, only to be awakened at 3 in the morning, then again at 6. By the time he got through the morning, feeding, and tried to start his ranch work, he was already exhausted. The worst part was the crying. Grace was generally a good baby, but she had fussy periods that could last for hours. Robert had no idea what he was doing wrong. He would check her diaper, try feeding her, rock her, walk with her, and sing the few songs he remembered. Sometimes, nothing worked and they would both end up crying together. One particularly difficult night, Grace had been crying for over 2 hours. Robert had tried everything he could think of. He was walking circles around the living room, bouncing her gently and feeling completely helpless. "Please, Grace," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know what you need. I don't know what your mama would do right now." That was the hardest part. The constant reminder that Lucy would have known what to do. She had read books about babies and talked to other mothers in town. She had been preparing for this in ways Robert never had. Now he was trying to learn, everything through trial and error, and Grace was paying the price for his inexperience. The financial pressure was mounting too. The medical bills from Lucy's delivery and funeral expenses had created debt that Robert wasn't sure how to handle. The ranch usually made enough money to support them, but only if he could keep up with the work. Cattle that weren't properly cared for wouldn't bring good prices at market. Fences that weren't maintained would lead to lost livestock. Robert's mother-in-law, Helen, had written several letters offering to come help. She lived back east in Ohio and had raised 4 children of her own. But Helen was in her 70s now, and Robert worried that the harsh Montana winter and isolated ranch life would be too much for her. Still, he was getting desperate enough to consider any option. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his new reality. Before Lucy died, they had enjoyed the quiet of ranch life. They would spend evenings talking about their day, making plans for the future, and simply enjoying each other's company. Now the silence felt oppressive, broken only by Grace's cries or the sound of wind around the house. Robert found himself talking to Grace constantly, partly because he had read that babies needed to hear voices, but mostly because he needed to hear his own voice to feel less alone. "Your mama loved this time of year," he would tell Grace as he fed her breakfast. She would make apple pie with apples from the tree behind the barn. The whole house would smell like cinnamon and love. During one of Frank Morrison's visits, Robert finally admitted how overwhelmed he felt. "I'm not doing right by her, Frank," Robert said, watching Grace sleep in her makeshift crib. "She deserves better than this. She deserves a mother who knows how to take care of babies." "You're doing the best you can," Frank replied. "That little girl is lucky to have a father who cares so much about her." But Robert wasn't convinced. Grace seemed fussier than other babies he had seen. She didn't smile as much as he thought she should. He worried that his inexperience was affecting her development. The ranch work continued to pile up. The barn roof had developed a leak that needed fixing before the heavy snows came. Several head of cattle had wandered through a broken section of fence and taken him half a day to round up. The hay he had cut earlier in the season needed to be moved into the barn, but it was a job that required both hands and full attention. Robert tried to work during Grace's nap times, but those periods were unpredictable and often short. Just when he would get started on a project, her cries would call him back to the house. He began to understand why ranching families usually had many children, not just for the joy of a big family, but for the practical help they provided. One cold December morning, Robert woke up to find that the water pipes in the kitchen had frozen overnight. This was a problem that needed immediate attention, or they would be without running water. But Grace was particularly fussy that day, and he couldn't put her down without her crying. He tried working with her strapped to his chest, but the space under the sink was too cramped. He tried leaving her in her crib, but her cries were so distressing that he couldn't concentrate. Finally, he bundled her up and made the difficult decision to ride to town and ask for help. The general store owner, Mr. Peterson, was sympathetic, but could only offer limited assistance. "I can come out tomorrow morning to help with the pipes," he said. "But Robert, you look terrible. When's the last time you had a full night's sleep?" Robert couldn't remember. The days and nights had blurred together into one long stretch of exhaustion and worry. That evening, as he tried to heat water on the stove for Grace's bottle and for washing dishes, Robert sat down at the kitchen table and looked around at what his life had become. Dirty clothes were piled on chairs. Empty bottles cluttered the counter. Bills were stacked unopened beside Lucy's favorite coffee cup, which he still couldn't bring himself to put away. Grace was asleep in her basket, finally. Peaceful after a difficult day, she looked so small and vulnerable. And Robert felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. "I'm sorry, Lucy," he whispered to the empty room. "I'm trying so hard, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to do this alone." Outside, the Montana wind howled around the house and snow began to fall again. Winter was still months away from ending, and Robert wondered how he would survive until spring. He loved Grace more than life itself, but love wasn't enough to solve the practical problems of single parenthood on an isolated ranch. As he sat in the quiet house, listening to his daughter's gentle breathing, Robert realized he needed to make some difficult decisions. He couldn't continue like this without risking both Grace's well-being and the ranch that was supposed to be her inheritance. The next morning brought new challenges, as every morning did, but it also brought a determination that Robert hadn't felt since Lucy's death. He couldn't give up, not when Grace was counting on him. Somehow he would find a way to be the father she needed and the rancher his family's legacy deserved. He just had to figure out how to do both without losing his mind in the process. The answer would have to come soon. because winter was closing in, and Robert knew that the hardest months were still ahead of them. December had arrived with a vengeance, bringing temperatures that made Robert's bones ache and snow that seemed to fall endlessly. He had been dreading the monthly community gathering at the church, but Mrs. Henderson had insisted that he and Grace needed to get out of the house. "You can't hide away forever, Robert," she had told him during her last visit. "That baby needs to see other people, and you need the company too." Robert knew she was right, but the thought of taking Grace out in public terrified him. What if she cried the entire time? What if other people saw how poorly he was managing as a single father? The shame of his struggles felt too heavy to bear in front of the whole community. But Grace had been particularly fussy for 3 days straight, and Robert was at his breaking point. Maybe a change of scenery would help both of them. He bundled Grace in every warm blanket he could find, placed her in a sturdy basket, and hitched up his wagon for the ride to town. The church was warm and welcoming when they arrived. Families had gathered for their monthly potluck dinner and social time. It was one of the few opportunities for the scattered ranch families to come together during the harsh winter months. Robert felt self-conscious as he carried Grace's basket inside. Several people approached to offer condolences and ask about the baby, but he could see the concern in their eyes. He knew he looked exhausted and probably smelled like he hadn't had time for a proper bath in days. "She's beautiful, Robert," said Mrs. Carey, peering into the basket. "She has Lucy's dark hair." Grace was awake and looking around with serious green eyes, taking in all the new sights and sounds. For once, she seemed content and curious rather than fussy. Robert found a quiet corner near the back of the church and set Grace's basket on a pew. He was hoping to stay out of the way and leave early if she started crying. But as the evening progressed, Grace remained calm, almost as if she enjoyed the gentle noise of conversation and laughter around her. It was during the dinner hour that Robert first noticed the woman sitting alone near the front of the church. She was quietly eating her meal, occasionally glancing around at the families with a sad expression. She looked to be in her 30s, with brown hair pulled back simply, and a dress that had seen better days but was clean and well-mended. "That's Mary O'Sullivan," whispered Mrs. Peterson, who had noticed Robert's gaze. "Poor thing lost her husband in a mining accident about 6 months ago. She's been struggling to keep her little homestead going by herself." Robert felt a pang of recognition. Here was someone else who understood the weight of unexpected loss and the challenge of carrying on alone. He watched as Mary finished her meal and began helping to clean up, working quietly and efficiently without drawing attention to herself. It was then that Grace decided to announce her presence to the entire gathering. Her cries started softly, but quickly escalated to the level that Robert had come to dread. He fumbled with her basket, trying to lift her out and calm her down, but his tired hands were clumsy and his nerves were frayed. "Shh, Grace. Please," he whispered desperately, aware that conversations around the church were stopping as people turned to look. "Please don't do this here." The crying intensified, and Robert felt his face burning with embarrassment. He was preparing to gather their things and make a hasty exit when a gentle voice spoke beside him. "May I try?" Robert looked up to see Mary O'Sullivan standing beside his pew. Her expression was kind and understanding, without a trace of judgment. She's been difficult lately," Robert stammered. "I probably should just take her home." "Sometimes babies just need a different touch," Mary said softly. "I have some experience with little ones." Robert hesitated for a moment, then handed Grace to Mary, feeling like he was admitting defeat. But as soon as Mary took the baby, something magical happened. Grace's cries began to quiet, and within a minute, she was calm and alert in Mary's arms. "How did you do that?" Robert asked, amazed. Mary smiled, the first genuine smile Robert had seen from her all evening. "She just needed to be held a different way. Sometimes they get overstimulated and need to feel secure." She demonstrated how she was supporting Grace's head and back, creating a cozy nest with her arms. Grace looked completely content, staring up at Mary with those serious green eyes. "You're a natural," Robert said, feeling a mixture of gratitude And inadequacy. I had some practice, Mary replied, a shadow passing over her face. My husband and we lost a baby boy about 2 years ago. Fever took him when he was just 8 months old. The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Robert felt his heart go out to her. Here was someone who truly understood loss in a way that few people could. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't know. Not many people talk about it, Mary said, gently rocking Grace. People don't know what to say about losing a child, so they usually say nothing at all. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching Grace's eyes grow heavy in Mary's arms. Around them, the church gathering continued with its warm buzz of conversation and laughter. She's beautiful, Mary said eventually. Lucy would be so proud. I hope so, Robert replied. I feel like I'm failing her every day. I don't know the first thing about raising a baby, especially a girl. You're keeping her fed and warm and loved, Mary said firmly. That's what matters most. The rest you can learn. Were you and your husband, did you have your homestead long? Robert asked, curious about this woman who seemed to understand both loss and resilience. 3 years, Mary replied. Patrick was working the copper mine to earn money to expand our land. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning. Cave-in trapped 12 men. Only 4 made it out. Robert could hear the carefully controlled emotion in her voice. She had learned to talk about her tragedy the way he was learning to talk about Lucy's death, with a protective numbness that kept the worst of the pain at bay. How do you manage the homestead alone? He asked. Mary laughed, but there was no humor in it. Barely. I have about 40 acres and a few chickens. I grow what vegetables I can and sell eggs in town when the chickens are laying well. It's not much, but it's ours. Robert could see the pride in her voice when she said ours, as if keeping the homestead was a way of honoring her husband's memory. Winter must be especially hard, he said. Everything's hard when you're alone, Mary replied simply. But you find ways to keep going. You have to. Grace had fallen asleep in Mary's arms, more peaceful than Robert had seen her in days. Mary continued to hold her, seeming reluctant to let go. Would you like me to put her back in the basket? Robert offered. In a minute, Mary said softly. I'd forgotten how good it feels to hold a baby. There was such longing in her voice that Robert felt his chest tighten with sympathy. He could see that Mary was a woman who was meant to be a mother, and the loss of her child had left a hole in her life that nothing could fill. As the evening began to wind down, Mary finally handed Grace back to Robert. The baby stirred but didn't wake, settling contentedly in her father's arms. Thank you, Robert said sincerely. You saved me from a very embarrassing situation. It was my pleasure, Mary replied. She's a special little girl. Robert was packing up Grace's things when he made a decision that surprised even him. Mary, I don't know if this is appropriate to ask, but would you consider helping me with Grace sometimes? I could pay you, of course, I'm struggling more than I want to admit. Mary's eyes widened with surprise, then filled with something that looked like hope. You would trust me with her? She asked. I can see how good you are with babies, Robert said. And honestly, I need help. The ranch work is suffering, and Grace deserves better care than I'm able to give her alone. Mary was quiet for a long moment, looking down at sleeping Grace. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. I would love to help, she said quietly. Taking care of her would be good for me too. They made arrangements for Mary to come to the ranch 3 mornings a week, starting the following Monday. As Robert loaded Grace's basket into his wagon for the ride home, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Lucy's death. Hope. The ride back to the ranch was peaceful, with Grace sleeping soundly in her basket. Robert found himself thinking about Mary's gentle hands and the way Grace had calmed immediately in her arms. Perhaps this was the answer to his prayers, a way for both him and Grace to heal while helping someone else heal too. For the first time in months, Robert went to sleep that night feeling like tomorrow might be better than today. He had found someone who understood loss and who could help him give Grace the care she deserved. As he lay in bed listening to Grace's quiet breathing from her crib nearby, Robert whispered a prayer of gratitude. Maybe, just maybe, they were all going to be okay. Monday morning arrived gray and cold with frost covering the windows of the ranch house. Robert had been awake since before dawn, not because Grace was crying, but because he was nervous about Mary's first day helping with her. He had cleaned the house as best he could, though he was embarrassed by how much work it still needed. Grace seemed to sense the change in routine. She was more alert than usual during her morning feeding, looking around as if expecting something different to happen. Robert found himself talking to her more than normal, explaining that a nice lady was coming to help take care of her. "You remember Mary, don't you?" he said as he changed her diaper. "She held you at the church and you liked her. She's going to spend some time with you today while Daddy catches up on ranch work." At exactly 8 o'clock, Robert heard the sound of wagon wheels crunching on the frozen ground outside. He looked out to see Mary climbing down from a small wagon pulled by a sturdy brown horse. She was carrying a cloth bag and moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to hard work. Robert opened the door before she could knock, holding Grace in his arms. "Good morning," Mary said with a warm smile. "How's our little one today?" The way she said, "our little one," made Robert's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It had been so long since anyone else had claimed any ownership or responsibility for Grace's well-being. "She slept better last night than she has in weeks," Robert replied, which was true. "I think she wore herself out at the church gathering." Mary stepped inside and immediately began removing her coat and gloves. She looked around the main room of the house, taking in the scattered baby items, the pile of unwashed dishes, and the general disorder that had become Robert's normal. "Why don't you show me where everything is?" Mary suggested gently. "Grace's bottles, clean diapers, clothes, that sort of thing." For the next 20 minutes, Robert gave Mary a tour of Grace's daily routine. He showed her how to warm the milk to just the right temperature, where the clean diapers were kept, and how Grace liked to be held when she was fussy. Mary listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and taking mental notes. "She usually gets hungry around 10 o'clock, Robert explained, and then again around 1. If she cries and it's not time to eat, sometimes walking around the house helps, and she likes this little song Lucy used to sing." He hummed a few bars of a lullaby, feeling awkward, but wanting Mary to have every tool that might help. "You've been doing a good job with her, Robert," Mary said softly. "I can tell she feels loved and secure." The validation meant more to Robert than he expected. For months, he had felt like he was failing Grace in every possible way. "I need to move the cattle to the lower pasture today," Robert said. "It's something I've been putting off, but it can't wait much longer. Will you be okay here with her?" "We'll be fine," Mary assured him. "Take as long as you need." As Robert prepared to leave for his first full day of ranch work since Grace was born, he felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. It felt strange to leave his daughter with someone else, but he could already see that Mary had a natural way with babies that he lacked. From the barn, Robert could hear Mary's voice drifting through the window as she talked to Grace. She was telling her about the flowers she was planning to plant in the spring and describing the chickens back at her own homestead. Her voice was soothing and musical, the kind of voice that would comfort a baby. The work of moving cattle was physically demanding, but Robert attacked it with energy he hadn't felt in months. For the first time since Lucy's death, he could focus completely on the task at hand without worrying about Grace's immediate needs. The cattle cooperated better than usual, as if they sensed his renewed confidence. When Robert returned to the house around noon, he found a scene that made him stop in his tracks. Mary was sitting in Lucy's rocking chair, feeding Grace her bottle while humming softly. The house was noticeably cleaner. Dishes were washed and put away. Baby clothes were folded neatly, and there was a warm smell coming from the kitchen. "How did it go?" Mary asked, looking up with a smile. "Better than it has in months," Robert replied honestly. "And it looks like things went well here, too." "Grace is wonderful," Mary said, looking down at the baby with obvious affection. "She's so alert and curious." I think she's going to be very smart." Robert felt a surge of pride at Mary's words. It had been a long time since anyone had complimented Grace or made positive observations about her development. "I hope you don't mind, but I made some soup for lunch," Mary continued. "I noticed you didn't have much prepared food in the house." The smell Robert had noticed was beef and vegetable soup simmering on the stove. His stomach rumbled, reminding him that he had been so focused on Grace's eating schedule that he often forgot about his own meals. They ate lunch together while Grace slept peacefully in her basket. It was the first real meal Robert had enjoyed in months, and more than that, it was the first time he had shared a meal with another adult since Lucy's death. "This is delicious," Robert said, savoring the warm soup. "I've been living mostly on coffee and whatever I could grab quickly." "Cooking for one person is hard," Mary agreed. "I find myself making too much food out of habit, then eating the same thing for days." As they talked, Robert learned more about Mary's life on her small homestead. She had been born in Ireland and came to America with her parents when she was 12. She met her husband Patrick at a church social, much like the one where she and Robert had connected. "Patrick was so excited about expanding our land," Mary said wistfully. "He had plans to buy the adjacent 40 acres and maybe raise some cattle. He was working extra shifts at the mine to save money for it." "It sounds like he was a good man," Robert said. "He was," Mary replied simply. "He would have loved Grace. Patrick always said he wanted a house full of children." After lunch, Mary insisted on staying until evening to help with Grace's afternoon routine. She seemed reluctant to leave, and Robert found himself hoping she would stay longer. "Same time Wednesday?" Mary asked as she prepared to go home. "Actually," Robert said, surprising himself, "would you consider coming more often, maybe 5 days a week? I can pay you more and it would help me catch up on all the work that's been piling up." Mary's face lit up with pleasure. "I would love that," she said. "Being here today, taking care of Grace, it felt like I had a purpose again." Over the following weeks, Mary became an essential part of Robert and Grace's daily routine. She arrived each morning promptly at 8 o'clock and stayed until late afternoon. Under her care, Grace began to thrive in ways that amazed Robert. She cried less, smiled more, and seemed more content overall. Mary brought order to the household that Robert had been unable to maintain. She cooked nutritious meals, kept the house clean, and even mended clothes that had been sitting in a pile for months. But more than that, she brought a feminine presence that the house had been missing since Lucy's death. "Grace rolled over today," Mary announced one afternoon in January, her voice filled with excitement. She was on her blanket on the floor and she just rolled right over onto her back. Robert felt a mixture of joy and sadness. He was thrilled about Grace's development, but sorry that he had missed this milestone. "I'm glad you were here to see it," he said, and meant it. Mary's obvious delight in Grace's achievements made them feel more special, not less. As winter deepened, Robert found himself looking forward to Mary's arrival each morning. She brought news from town, stories about her own life, and a perspective on problems that often helped him see solutions he had missed. One snowy afternoon, when Grace was napping and they were both working on mending clothes, Mary made an observation that surprised Robert. "Grace is starting to look like you," she said, studying the sleeping baby. "She has your stubborn chin." Robert laughed. "Lucy always said I was too stubborn for my own good." "It's not always a bad thing," Mary said with a smile. "Stubborn people don't give up easily. That's probably why you've managed to keep everything together during such a difficult time." The compliment made Robert feel warm in a way he hadn't experienced since Lucy's death. Mary had a way of making him feel capable and strong rather than inadequate and overwhelmed. As February approached, Robert realized that he had begun to depend on Mary for more than just childcare. She had become his confidant, his partner, in daily decisions and his source of emotional support. When Grace was fussy, Mary knew exactly what to do. When Robert was worried about ranch problems, Mary listened and offered thoughtful advice. More importantly, Grace had clearly bonded with Mary. She would light up when Mary arrived in the morning and fuss when it was time for her to leave. Mary sang to her, played with her, and treated her with the kind of natural maternal love that Robert had feared Grace would never experience. One evening, as Mary was preparing to leave after a particularly good day, Robert found the courage to express what he had been feeling. "Mary, I need you to know how grateful I am," he said, "not just for taking care of Grace, but for everything you've done for both of us. I don't think we would have made it through this winter without you." Mary's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked down at her hands. "Taking care of Grace has been healing for me too," she said quietly. "I feel useful again. I feel like I matter." Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that Robert hadn't felt since before Lucy's death. The snow melted faster than usual, revealing green grass that seemed more vibrant than he remembered. Grace was now 6 months old, sitting up on her own and babbling constantly, filling the house with sounds of joy rather than the desperate cries that had dominated the winter months. Mary had become such an integral part of their daily lives that Robert could hardly remember what it had been like before she arrived. She came earlier and stayed later now, often helping with evening chores and staying for dinner. Grace's face would light up every morning when she heard Mary's wagon approaching, and she had started reaching for Mary with the same enthusiasm she showed for Robert. It was on a warm April evening, while they were sitting on the porch watching Grace play with wooden blocks that Robert had carved for her, that Robert first acknowledged to himself what had been growing in his heart for months. He was falling in love with Mary O'Sullivan. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. He felt guilty for developing feelings for another woman when Lucy had been gone for less than a year, but he also felt more alive than he had since the tragedy, more hopeful about the future than he had thought possible. "She's getting so big," Mary said, watching Grace stack blocks with determined concentration. "Soon she'll be crawling everywhere." "I know," Robert replied, but he wasn't really thinking about Grace's development. He was thinking about how natural Mary looked in this setting, how perfectly she fit into the life he and Lucy had built together. That night, after Mary had gone home and Grace was asleep, Robert found himself walking to the small cemetery plot where Lucy was buried. It was something he did often, especially when he was struggling with difficult decisions or emotions. "I don't know what to do, Lucy," he said quietly, kneeling beside her simple wooden cross. "I never expected to feel this way about anyone again. I thought what we had was once in a lifetime." The spring wind rustled through the new grass, and Robert could almost hear Lucy's voice in the gentle sound. She had always been practical about difficult situations, always encouraged him to be honest about his feelings. "Mary's wonderful with Grace," he continued. "Our daughter lights up around her in ways that remind me of how she would have been, with you, and Mary. She makes me want to be a better man, a better father." Robert sat in the peaceful quiet for a long time, feeling Lucy's presence and somehow sensing her approval. When he finally returned to the house, he felt a clarity about his feelings that he hadn't experienced before. The next few weeks passed quickly as Robert struggled with how and when to express his feelings to Mary. He didn't want to jeopardize the wonderful arrangement they had built, but he also couldn't ignore the growing connection between them. Mary seemed to be experiencing similar feelings. Robert caught her looking at him with expressions that went beyond friendship or professional care. When their hands accidentally touched while they were both reaching for Grace, the moment lingered longer than it should have. When she laughed at his stories or offered comfort during difficult moments, there was an intimacy that felt like more than friendship. The turning point came on a beautiful May evening when Grace had been particularly charming all day. She had learned to clap her hands and was delighting in the sound, clapping and laughing with infectious joy. "Listen to her," Mary said, laughing along with Grace. "She's discovered she can make noise on purpose." "She's going to be a handful," Robert said, but his voice was full of love and pride. "She's going to be wonderful," Mary corrected. "Strong and independent and full of life, just like her parents." The way Mary said parents, including herself in that description, made Robert's heart race. He looked at her sitting there with Grace in her lap, both of them laughing, and the words came out before he could stop them. "Mary, I need to tell you something." She looked up at him with questioning eyes, and Robert felt his courage almost fail him. But Grace chose that moment to reach for him, babbling da da da, and the sight of the two people he loved most in the world sitting together gave him strength. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "I know it's complicated and I know it hasn't been very long since Lucy died, but I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just gratitude or friendship." Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Robert," she whispered. "I understand if you don't feel the same way," he continued quickly. "And I understand if you think it's too soon. But I needed you to know that you've become more than just Grace's caregiver. You've become essential to both of us." Mary was quiet for a long moment, looking down at Grace, who was contentedly playing with the buttons on Mary's dress. "I've been fighting the same feelings," she said finally. "I kept telling myself it was just because I missed having a family, missed being needed. But it's more than that." She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "I love Grace like she's my own daughter," Mary continued. "And I love you, Robert. I love the man you are, the father you've become, the way you've survived something that would have broken a lesser person." Relief and joy flooded through Robert's chest. "Really? Really?" Mary said, smiling through her tears. "But Robert, I need you to know that I'm not trying to replace Lucy. I know how much you loved her, and I would never want to diminish that." "You're not replacing her," Robert said firmly. "You're helping me build something new, something different, but just as meaningful." Grace, seeming to sense the importance of the moment, looked back and forth between them and clapped her hands again, making them both laugh. "I think she approves," Mary said. Over the following weeks, Robert and Mary carefully navigated their changing relationship. They spent more time talking about their hopes for the future, their shared experiences of loss, and their dreams for Grace's upbringing. "I want her to know about Lucy," Mary said one evening as they watched Grace practice, crawling across the living room floor. "I want her to grow up knowing how much her mother loved her and what kind of woman she was." "I was hoping you'd feel that way," Robert replied. "Lucy will always be Grace's mother. But I hope you'll consider being her mother too." Summer approached. Robert knew he wanted to marry Mary. He also knew he wanted to do it properly, with Lucy's blessing and the community's support. One warm June evening, he asked Mary to walk with him to Lucy's grave. Grace crawled beside them in the soft grass, exploring everything she could reach. "Lucy," Robert said, kneeling beside the cross with Mary beside him, "I want you to meet Mary O'Sullivan. She's been taking care of Grace and me, and she's brought joy back into our lives. I love her, and I want to ask her to marry me." He turned to Mary, who was crying softly. "Mary O'Sullivan, will you marry me? Will you help me raise Grace and build a life together on this ranch?" "Yes," Mary whispered. "Yes, I will." Grace, who had crawled over to Lucy's cross, pulled herself up to standing and babbled happily, as if giving her own approval to the arrangement. They were married in August in the same church where they had first met. Grace, now crawling everywhere and pulling herself up on furniture, wore a white dress that Mary had sewn herself. The whole community turned out to celebrate, and Robert felt surrounded by love and support. During the ceremony, Robert included a moment to honor Lucy's memory, thanking her for bringing Grace into the world and for somehow guiding Mary into their lives when they needed her most. "Love isn't diminished by sharing it," the pastor said during the service. "Sometimes the greatest tribute to love lost is the courage to love again." As they exchanged vows, Grace sat contentedly in Mrs. Henderson's lap, occasionally clapping her hands at the proceedings as if she understood that something wonderful was happening. Their first year of marriage brought challenges and adjustments, but it also brought profound joy. Mary proved to be everything Robert had hoped: a loving mother to Grace, a partner in running the ranch, and a companion who understood both his grief and his determination to build a good life. Grace thrived under Mary's care, growing into a curious and spirited toddler who clearly adored both her parents. She began walking at 10 months, chattering constantly, and showing signs of the stubborn independence that both Robert and Mary encouraged. On a crisp autumn evening, almost exactly 2 years after Lucy's death, Robert stood on his porch, watching Mary teach Grace to feed chickens in the yard. Grace was giggling as the chickens pecked grain from her small hands, and Mary was patiently showing her how to scatter the feed evenly. The ranch was more prosperous than it had ever been. With Mary's help, Robert had been able to expand their cattle operation and improve their crops. They had added on to the house, creating a proper nursery for Grace and a larger kitchen where Mary could pursue her love of cooking. But more than the material improvements, Robert felt a deep contentment that he had never expected to experience again. He had learned that love wasn't a finite resource, that opening his heart to Mary hadn't diminished his love for Lucy, but had instead created space for more love, more joy, more hope. Grace ran up to the porch, her cheeks red from the cool air, and her eyes bright with excitement. "Papa," she called, using the word she had recently learned. "Chickens."